So some big command point shakeups are coming. A lot of armies are going to be starting with 5 command points less than before. So what effects might this have on games of Warhammer 40k? Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today I thought it would be good to look a little bit more in depth about the proposed command point changes that are going to be coming out sometime in the next few months. It looks like armies are going to be starting on a lot fewer and instead have them distributed over the course of the whole game, which could seriously throw a spanner in the works for the way that a few armies play at the moment. These command point changes were announced that they're going to be happening at Warhammer Fest. As we know, Games Workshop seems to be pushing the idea of a seasonal version for Warhammer 40k and is going to be releasing another chapter approved for Warzone Nephilim, the one that's going to follow the current Nachmund one. As they suggested that these season things will be happening once every 6 months, that would mean it will be somewhere around July perhaps, though they do tend to be a bit fluid on these exact release dates. I wouldn't be enormously surprised if we see it towards the end of June or perhaps early August. In any case, somewhere within the next few months. They did mention in a really quite nice change that instead of having points cost printed in the book, they'd instead be free to digitally download, which is a really nice update compared with the previous one, and it means that they'll be able to make points cost changes based on the current meta rather than 6 months ago when they have to print this. But apparently the biggest shake-up will be that most armies will be starting with around half as many CP as before, but gain twice the normal amount each turn for being battle forged. My guess is that it would mean that armies would start on 7 command points rather than the normal 12 in games of 2000 points, as then that would still add up to the same amount that you have currently. Normally you have 17 over the course of a game, 12 at the start, and then 5, 1 on each turn throughout the game. It's really quite an interesting shake-up and doing things very differently to how the edition started out. It does mean that a lot of choices have to be made with what sort of things you spend in the first few turns, and in particular what sort of things you choose to buy in before the game starts. Currently I have no idea whether or not this is something that they're going to keep and move on to future tournament packs like this, or whether it's the sort of thing that might just be around for a themed season of 40k. A bit of a twist for more competitive games, and they would move on to a different shake-up for the next one. I would bear in mind as well that this command point change looks like it'll be for tournament match play only and not applying to more general things like Eternal War. This book is called the Warzone Nephilim Grand Tournament Mission Pack, so if you're playing the Eternal War missions, it probably won't apply. To be honest, I think that could be just a bit annoying and problematic. A lot of people do follow along and play the Grand Tournament missions each time they update the book, but a fair few people just generally play it at a bit more of a casual level and say just play missions out of the main book. So now, when you're organising a game, you might have discrepancies as to whether or not you're even building the list for the same gaming system. If every army does only have 7 command points to spend pre-game, then the people who have 12 to start with could actually make entire lists that just wouldn't even be legal at all in the 7 command point one, things that spent very, very heavy pre-game and then had less to play with in the game. Might just be another one of those annoying things that you have to negotiate with the other person when you're deciding what sort of 40k game you want to play. I believe that this also wouldn't apply to those Tempest of War missions if you happen to be playing with that new card deck. I think perhaps the biggest change to army construction that will come out of this is that it'll put quite a lot of pressure on the amount of command points that you have at the start of the game, and it'll make things like buying in warlord traits, relics, and anything else that you might spend command points on pre-game into a bit more of a questionable idea. Even an extra 3 CP for, say, a Vanguard or an Outrider detachment would look kind of painful. Never mind, say, if you wanted to run a super heavy detachment alongside your force, say bring along a trio of Necron Monoliths or Astra Militarum Baneblades, that 6 command point spend for the super heavy detachment would be pretty much undoable, unless you wanted to be starting on basically 0 CP and maybe only have one other to buy in an extra warlord trait or relic or something. I think it'll certainly make life a bit easier for armies that can happily field their entire force within one battalion, and even branching out to something like a patrol detachment is going to hurt. Otherwise, extra warlord traits and relics typically cost an extra command point each in most armies. It's really not too uncommon for a lot of armies to spend 2 or 3 CP extra on these, as they're quite powerful in-game abilities that you can have all battle long. If you have a few of them plus an extra detachment of some point, you are going to wind up with fairly limited options as to what you can do stratagem-wise turn 1. And several armies do have other upgrades and options that you can spend CP on pre-game, things like Guard tank cases, Space Marine relic datasheets. All of those might be just a little bit tougher to justify. It's basically the same thing for any army that really wanted to go to town on the stratagems on turn 1 as well. Often in competitive games of 40k, it usually makes sense to spend the bulk of your command points in the first few battle rounds, The idea being that if you can get a leg up early, then that's normally going to be more powerful than getting the same benefit later. Say if you spend some command points to wind up in the death of an extra unit turn 1, then that's going to be 4 turns that the opponent's not going to be able to do things with that unit, as opposed to if you did the same thing turn 4, then it would only be taken out of action for turn 5. I have a feeling that this might be the main motivation for why they made this change, to basically see command points as a bit more of an ongoing resource rather than something that you try and spend as quickly as possible in big wombo combos, and more something that you can use to make a few key things happen each and every turn. In any case, if you did own a unit that was spectacularly dangerous and you needed to spend a couple of command points to get it in position, then some more command points on some maximal damage dealing, that could drain most or all of your command points once you take into account pre-game spends. For the rest of the game though, I think the turn-by-turn 2 command points is pretty interesting. A lot of the time, once you or your opponent has burnt through their command points, you might know that you can just breathe easy, and your opponent's got certain stratagems and options that are just out of reach now. A common one maybe being the 2 command point stratagem counter-offensive to interrupt in combat. Now if both players are gaining command points each turn, it means that that's often going to be at least a threat that you need to think about, and you're rarely going to be able to write off any of the opponent's stratagems as out of their reach. I think on a turn-by-turn perspective, it does make the decision process a bit more tricky with how you're going to spend your command points. When you're just generating 1 per turn and you might have burnt through most of the rest, it often becomes a case of would I rather do this with my 1 command point, or would I rather save it for another powerful damage dealing stratagem next turn, or an all-important charge reroll. It's not going to be quite as cut and dry with 2, say whether or not you blow it on a more expensive stratagem, or use it on 2 minor ones and keep 1 back in reserve. I think in general, overall, the command points being limited so you have to access them later in the game will probably slightly reduce the power of stratagems in general. It could certainly be handy enough for last turn things like anything that you could use to trade command points for victory points, say just throwing them at saves on a unit to maybe try and unlikely survive on an objective, or perhaps using mobility stratagems to jump onto objectives yourselves. But I think in general, if you just had the choice of when to spend stratagems, then having access to them earlier is more powerful. If it was really the best thing to keep them till the very end of the game, then you'd still have the option to be able to do that, or you could spend them very heavily in the earlier turns to try and gain those advantages. I don't think that the redistribution is going to vastly change things, but I think it probably does amount to a subtle nerf to the value of stratagems in general. Otherwise, thinking about some more faction-specific stuff, in general armies are going to have a bit less of a safety net for running out of command points early, and that could mean anything that artificially drains command points that little bit easier could be even more punishing. Maybe people might be a bit more tempted to run a Calidus Assassin for their Reign of Confusion and putting pressure on the opponent's command point reserves, or the Drukhari Blackheart Agents of Vect option, that again could be additionally punishing if you don't have many CP to play with in the early rounds. On a faction by faction basis, I think in general it's going to favour armies that tend to be a bit more elite, things like Custodies or Grey Knights who could quite comfortably fit their entire force within a single battalion, and maybe be a bit more painful for armies that really want to skew to one type of detachment slot, say for example Orc Buggy lists needing an Outrider detachment. I think it might also encourage less people to use detachment spam to get multiple copies of a similar datasheet. That can be popular for things like Tau Commanders and Hive Tyrants, where spending an extra couple of command points on additional patrols really isn't the worst thing if you are accessing more of one of the nastiest datasheets in the codex. Overall, I don't think it's going to make cataclysmic changes to lists, but it might just encourage a fair few people to tweak theirs slightly and think a little bit more about their pre-game spend, though I think there perhaps are a few armies that might feel it a bit more than others. Space Marines and Chaos Marines might be a bit less tempted to bring along things like Relic Contemptors. Losing an extra command point as part of your cost just became a bit more painful. Cadian White Shield conscripts can be quite a big drain of CP, never mind the detachments to get them on the board in the first place. It might potentially be another unhelpful thing for AdMech. They aren't exactly very strong right now, plus they, maybe more than just about any other faction, often want to spend a lot of command points pre-game. They've got some very nice buffing warlord traits and relics, and it's a lot more tempting to take them than in most armies, as you can throw a lot of them into relatively safe squads too. Maybe one of the armies that has made out best of it though might be the Imperial Knights. If they manage to remain honoured and keep their oath, they'll now be generating a massive 3 command points each and every turn. It might matter a bit less just how many pre-game command points you have if you are generating that kind of power. Anyway, I look forward to hearing what you guys have to say. How do you think that these command point things are going to affect your army? Is it going to be a big change or a minor niggle? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. If you've enjoyed the video, feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, while I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming, with new ones out just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page, and you can find that down in the video description below. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some really big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.